Components of a market. So what is a market? Well, let's take a look. So we just went over buyers and sellers, why they're important to price, and how they tell the story. So a market is a place where buyers and sellers meet to exchange a good or service. In the past, a long time ago, this was a physical market where buyers and sellers were meeting together to trade physical assets. Now we look at this as a virtual market or exchanges, which we will be focusing on, where buyers and sellers are meeting to trade assets. These assets can range from equities, bonds, currencies, derivatives, commodities, and in the case of many of you taking this course, cryptocurrencies. So why are the buyers and sellers important? Well, as we touched on before, this section being supply and demand, buyers equal demand and sellers equal supply. We want to try to identify the exhaustion point of either party. So at what point is the buyer running out of steam to push price higher? And at what point is the seller running out of steam to push price lower? Let's take a look at an example and see what I mean by this. So here we have a very basic chart, no numbers on it, and as we can see, it's represented in Japanese candlesticks. So just like we looked at the story of how the candles were telling us what we think is going to happen or who's in control, let's start to focus on the larger conversation of buyers and sellers, and ultimately supply and demand. Let's start on the left side here. We can see that price made a very large impulse down, and the buyers, or a demand zone, stepped in right here. Now, if we look at this candlestick, we can see that this is a long lower wick. Buyers are present here. They push the price up a little more, run into a supply zone, sellers. Price comes back down. But where does it come back down to? A buyer demand zone. We had identified this as an area where buyers were present. So just as we thought, here's a long lower wick showing us that the buyers are in control, pushing price up into an area where the sellers are stepping in, an exhaustion point by the buyers, and this is identified as our supply zone. We know that price was stopped here, so if it was to return to this area, our sellers and supply would come into the market. Well, let's see. Price goes down, we return back up into our supply zone. Here's our wick that showed an exhaustion point, and the sellers take over. And we can see this pattern repeating, or this conversation amongst buyers and sellers, and we want to recognize sellers with supply and buyers with demand. One of the important things that we want to take away from this is that there is a finite amount of buyers and sellers. So what do I mean by that? Well, this demand zone only has so many buyers. At some point in time, there will be no more buyers. This causes a breakdown, or on the opposite side of the spectrum, there are so many sellers in a supply zone. At some point in time, this supply zone will run out of sellers, and that will cause a breakout. And those are some topics that we're going to get into later on in some of the more advanced sections of this course. But let's switch over to a live example and pull up a chart and see this in real time. So here I have my chart of Bitcoin on a daily time frame, and I'm going to try to identify a supply and demand zone where I think the buyers and sellers are having a good conversation to show you what I mean by this. Let's take this area right here. I'm going to drop my time frame, and I'm going to look at this particular point in time. Let's clean the chart up, erase that. So let's get our horizontal line tool, and let's try to mark off our supply zone where we think the sellers are. Well, this is a nice wick showing us that price was rejected here and pushed back down. So let's start right here. Now, let's look at where the buy zone is. 1, 2, 3. Here's a good indication of buyers present. Now these don't have to be perfect for the purposes of this example, but we want to understand how price interacts between buyers and sellers in a demand zone and a supply zone. So let's go over what we see. Well, sellers stepped in here. We see an exhaustion wick by the buyer. Price comes back down. This is our demand zone. We know that buyers are present. So let's mark that off as our demand buyers. I like to mark up my charts because it helps me understand the story and focus on the important areas of the chart. So our demand zone and buyers are present. If price were to come back here, we would expect a positive reaction. Let's see. Here we are, we're moving up, come to an exhaustion point, we're coming back down. Who's here? Our buyers. Demand zone pushes the price up into a supply zone right here where the sellers are present. We're coming back down. Ooh, who's here? Buyers. 1, 2, 3. Recognize this candle from the previous lessons. This is a nice reversal candle, a long lower wick. Here we are, we have the buyers in control, the uptrend is resuming, and what happens? Ooh, here is our supply zone. Well, let's mark this off, and who is here? Supply, sellers. We can see some exhaustion wicks up here. One last try to push price up. Buyers are running out of steam, the sellers are stepping in, and the pattern repeats. We move down slowly. We see our buyers stepping in here, pushing the price up, not far enough into our supply zone, suggesting that the buyers are really running out of steam. And as I mentioned before, our buyer demand zone is finite. There's only so many buyers. And we can see here that the buyers ran out. And we'll get into it in later lessons to help identify some hints to see, is a breakdown coming or is a breakout coming? But the important part of this lesson is, where are the buyers? Where are the sellers? What is the conversation and ping-pong-like effect price is doing in this consolidation range period? And as a trader, I want to identify a demand zone as buyers, so maybe getting long or buying the asset. And at supply zones, where the sellers are, I want to look at selling or shorting. And these are topics that we're going to get into later on. But the important thing to grasp is supply and demand, buyers and sellers, and ultimately this is going to revert all back to support and resistance, which Zorn will go over. But let's do a quick recap here. So, supply and demand is our conversation between buyers and sellers. We learned that our buyers and sellers were represented through Japanese candlesticks. So now we're taking it a step further and seeing where are those groups of buyers and sellers on our chart. We want to identify the exhaustion points of either party, a buyer or seller, to help recognize inflection points in price. Where are the sellers stepping in to push price down? Where are the buyers stepping in to push price up? And lastly, supply and demand equals buyers and sellers. And buyers and sellers are going to be the building block of support and resistance, or SR, which Zorn is going to go over now.